So in this video you have learned how to test a React component and a little bit of the flow for testing a React component. Hello there, my name is Thiago. I'm a front-end developer and this is the second video of a series on automated testing in React applications. So in the first video we saw a very fast introduction to automated testing in JavaScript or TypeScript applications. And in this video we'll see the basics of how to test a React component. So we're going to learn the flow for testing a component, the syntax for doing that, and we'll learn that by testing a simple component, okay? You can find the link for the repository with the source code that I will start from in this video in the description down below. So if you want to follow me along step by step in this video, you can just clone the repo. Okay, so now we can see how to test a React component. So to do that, let's first run our application. So I'll type yarn dev and the app will start in the port 3000. So localhost 3000 in our browser. Okay, so here we have the UI for this app. And we have two buttons that change the current component. So we have this counter component and a calculator component that we'll be testing in the next video. So let's just focus in the counter component for now. And in this counter component we have a heading with the current number of counter. And we also have some buttons that change the current count number. So I can press increment and it increments the counter by 1. I can press decrement and it decrements the counter by 1. I can also double the current counter, so it is 5. When I press, it goes to 10. And there's also a button to get the half of the numbers. So for example, if the current number is 8, when I click half, it goes to 4, and then it goes to 2, and so forth. So this is a very simple component, but we're gonna start testing it because it's going to be easier to test a simple component, and after that we can move to test more complex components. Okay, so the code for this component is under source components counter.tsx, and as you can see, this component was created using the class component syntax, which is not used anymore nowadays. The recommended way to create components is using functional components with hooks like useState, useEffect, and so forth. But I have done that here just to show you that after writing the tests for the component, we can refactor it to be a functional component, and after refactoring it, we'll not have to change any single line of code in the test file, because we'll not be testing implementation details, we'll be testing the behavior of the component. And since we refactor the component and the behavior is to be the same, then we'll not have to change anything in the tests. Okay, so as you can see, it's a very simple component. We have a counter state which starts at 0. Then we have 4 methods that update that counter state. So for example, increment updates the counter state to be the current counter plus 1. Decrement updates the counter state to be the current counter minus 1, and so forth. And we also have this render method which returns the JSX for the component. And in here we have an h1 with the current counter, and we have the 4 buttons that call those methods. So it's a very simple component, and let's start testing it. So first of all, let's create the test file. Okay, in this case we are testing this counter.tsx, so let's create a file called counter.test.tsx, and in here the file extension must be .tsx, because inside of our test file we're gonna be writing JSX. If the file extension is not TSX, then TypeScript will not understand JSX. So before writing the real code for the test, let me summarize some things that we're gonna need to understand in order to test a component, okay? First, the anatomy of our test here is gonna be pretty similar to what we have done in the calculator test. So we're gonna have a group of test cases, our actual test cases, and inside our test cases we're gonna have our assertions, right? But what I want to highlight to you here is the flow for testing a React component is a bit different from testing just a pure function as we were doing here. So the flow for testing a React component is, first, you render the component. Second, you interact with the component if necessary. And last, you check if things are as you expected them to be. Okay, so now we can start coding our test. Okay, so let's import counter from /counter, and let's create our describe with the name of the component, so component counter. I think I have forgot to show you, but the extension that I'm using here to create these snippets of describe, it, and so forth is this extension right here, just snippets from Andis 8. So if you want to install it, you can just come to your extensions section of VS Code and search for just snippets and you'll find it. Okay, so back to our test. So now we would write our test cases, right? But there's one thing I like to do before writing the test cases, which is I first analyze the component and then I can start writing my test cases. Okay, so I'll create a comment for that. And the test cases for the counter component are: the user should be able to increment the current counter, the user should be able to decrement the counter, the user should be able to double the counter, and also to get the half of the counter. So we'll have a test case for each of these buttons, right? So we're gonna have a test case for increment, decrement, double, and half. And I usually like to do a test case to check the renderization of the component, so we can see if the component is rendering correctly, especially in its initial rendering, so we can check the initial state and things like that. So initial render. So now that we have these kind of a to-do list, right, like tasks to do, I want to show you a more well-structured way to create these kind of to-do lists and tests. You can use a comment if you want, but there's a more elegant way to do that, which is using it.todo. And it.todo takes a string with the test case, so like it should do something. So let's run the test file. I'll open my terminal, I'll stop the front-end app, and I'll run yarn test counter.test.tsx. And as you can see, the test runner says we have two tests inside our component counter describe, and one of them is passing, and it is this one, and the other is being skipped because it has nothing to test, right? It's a task to do. And this modifier is also very useful because when you have tasks in a large project, sometimes you can forget to test something, so you can just come in your VS Code and search for .todo, and if you find any file with this .todo, then you know it's a task that you forgot to do probably. And I also like doing these to-dos because, you know, you write all the to-dos for a component and then you will not accidentally forget to test something, so it's very useful. So in this case we're gonna have 5 to-dos, right? one for the initial render, and I usually call it should render correctly. The other ones I'm going to call it should increment correctly. I'll duplicate one more so we can have 5 in total, and the name of these ones are gonna be it should increment correctly, decrement correctly, double, and half. Okay, so now we can delete this comment and save the file, and there it is. So we have all to-dos right here, and now we can see how to test a React component. Okay, so to test a React component, we need a way to render it and interact with it, right? And to do that, we're gonna use testing library, which is a library used to test components and pages in a lot of UI frameworks like React, Vue, and so forth. And for this case, we're gonna be using the package for testing React applications, which is this testing library /React. So let's start testing our component. Okay, so in here we'll not have to install the package because it's already installed. I have installed before the video. Okay, so let's import from testing library /React a function called render. This render function renders a component. So let's remove this .todo from the first test. Let's add a callback to that, and inside our test, the first thing we need to do is to render our component, right? So let's render counter, and in this case we want to check if things are as we expected them to be. So in this case we'll not interact with the component because it's just a renderization test. So we're gonna check if things are in the document, if the component has rendered the elements correctly. And to do that, we're gonna need to get the elements, and then we can make our assertions on those elements. Okay, so to get the elements, we're gonna need to use one more thing from testing library, which is screen. A screen is an object with a lot of selectors to find your elements. So we can use get by text, for example, to get an element by its text, or we can use get by label text to get an element by its label, and there are a lot of other different selectors in here, but we're not going to use all of them in this video. You actually learn more about them as you need, so if you keep practicing, you'll get to know more of these selectors. Okay, for this video, the selector we're going to use is get by test ID, which is the easiest one, and we're going to be using it just for learning purposes. Okay, it's not recommended to use this selector because there are better options of selectors than this one that tests things like accessibility, for example. But for this video we're going to use this one because it's the easiest one, as I have said. So to start, let's get our elements, right? So I'll create a const heading that receives the return of get by test ID, and this ID in here is an ID that we add to our element in its JSX. So in here, for example, in our heading we have a data test ID with the value of counter. So this is the test ID for the H1. So in this case I'm gonna call it counter heading, and the test ID right here is counter. Okay, so now let's just take the other elements. So I'll say const increment button equals screen.get by test ID, and the test ID for the increment button is increment dash button, and I'll duplicate this line and I'll change increment here to decrement, half, and double. So now that we have our elements, we just need to check if these elements are in the page, right? And to do that, we're going to use an assertion. So we're going to use expect, and in the calculator test we have used expect dot to be, right? Because we were just comparing numbers, okay? But in this case we want to check if these elements are in the document or in the page. And to do that, there is another assertion called to be in the document, and it's going to check if our elements are in the page. So I just need to put the element inside expect, and let's duplicate this line and update the elements inside of the expects. Okay, so now I can save the file and the test will automatically run. And there it is, the test is passing. If I, for example, comment this h1, for example, will not have in the counter heading anymore, so the test must fail, right? Because we expect the heading to be in the document. And there it is. The test has failed in this line, in the get by test ID counter, and it says unable to find an element by test ID counter. So it also prints the HTML of our component. In this case we can see that we don't have any h1 in here because I have put a comment here. So I'm going to remove the comment and save, and there it is, the test is passing. So now let's move to our next test case. So I'm going to remove this dot to do. I'm going to add the arrow function, and in this case we want to check if the component increments correctly. So first we need to render the component, and the behavior for the increment feature is our component starts at 0, then the user clicks the increment button, and then the component updates the current counter. We'll do that. These things that I just did in my browser, we'll do that programmatically in our test. So it's gonna be pretty simple. First, I want to take the heading because I want to check if the current counter is 0, right? So I've got the heading, and then I'm gonna say expect counter heading, and in this case I want to check if the text content of the counter heading is counter 0. So to do that we can use dot to have text content, and it will take the text content of the element and check if it's what we expect that to be. So I expect that to be counter 0. In this case I'm going to put a 50 right here just to see if the test fails. Okay, so let's save the file, and there it is, the test failed, saying that we expected the element to have a text content of counter 50 and it actually had a counter 0, so it's right. Let's put a counter 0 here. And in this case we could have used another assertion here. Instead of passing the element right here and to have text content, we could have used dot text content inside of the expect, and the text content is the string with the text content, of course, and we could have used to be. That would also works, but as I have said before, this is not very semantic, right? If you have a semantic assertion, use that primarily, okay? Okay, so our counter is starting at 0, and I actually think this is a good expect to have in the first test as well. Since it's a renderization test, we should be checking if the initial state is 0. So I'll paste this assertion right here also. So now what we need to do is interact with the component. So we need to click the increment button to update the counter state, so we can check if the counter heading is 1, right? So I'm going to duplicate this line and put it at the end. So to click the button, we first need to get it, right? So I'm going to copy the selector for the button, And now that I have the button right here, I need to click it. So to interact with elements in testing library, we need to use another package from testing library called user event. So I'm going to import user event from testing library / user event. And in here we need to type user event dot click. Then we pass the element. So the first argument is the element. So let's put our button in here. And as you can see, it returns a promise. So we need to await for that. And to use await, we need to make the function asynchronous. So it's going to click the button, and after that we can check if the text content is counter 1. So I'm going to save the file and I expect that to pass. So there it is, the task is passing. If I click another button, for example the decrement button, when we click it, the counter will not be 1. It will actually be -1, as you can see in here. So in this case we want to click the increment button, in fact. So let's put increment here and save the file. And now let's move to our next test case. So let's remove this .todo. Let's add an asynchronous callback. Let's copy this code from the increment test case. In this case, we want to click the decrement button. So I'm going to rename this constant to decrement button. I'll use a shortcut with F2 and I'll say decrement button, enter, and then VS Code automatically change the variable name right here. And I also need to change the test ID to decrement button. And after clicking the decrement button, we expect to have a counter -1. So let's save the file with -1. And there it is, the test is passing. So now let's move to our next test case. I'm gonna add an asynchronous arrow function, and I'll copy the code from the test case above. And in this case we want to check if the component can double the current counter correctly. So to do that, I'll do a flow like I'll click the increment button twice, and then I can click the double button and check if the current counter is 4. So let's do that. First we'll need the increment button, so I'm going to increment button, and we'll also need to take the double button. So in here I'll take the double button, and here the increment button. So we're gonna click the increment button twice, and after clicking it twice I expect the current counter to be 2, and after checking if it's 2 I want to click the double button. So I'm going to do user event dot click double button, and after clicking the double button I expect the text content to be 4, right? I'm gonna put a 5 in here just to see if the test fails, okay? So here it is, the test failed, and it says we expected 5 but we received 4, and the 4 here is right, so let's put a 4 here again, save the file, and there it is, the test is passing. So let's code our last test case. I'll add a synchronous callback, I'll paste the code, and in here we want to test the half correctly. So to do that, I think I can click the increment button 4 times. After clicking 4 times, I expect the counter to be 4, and after that I'll click the half button. I need to change the test ID, and after clicking the half button I expect the current counter to be 2, right? In this case, I'm gonna put a 3 in here just to see if the test fails again. And there it is, the test fails. So the 2 is right here. And there it is. We have finished testing our counter component, and we have covered all lines of it since we have tested all its 4 methods. There's nothing in here that we didn't execute. So now that we have finished testing it, we can refactor it to be a functional component. And you'll see that we'll not have to change any single line of code in our test file in order to make it pass, because in here we have tested the behavior of the component, and since we refactor the component and the behavior keeps the same, we'll not have to change anything in the test. Okay, so let's refactor it, and first let's make it a function. So export the full function counter, and I think we can remove this import from React. The state needs to be created with useState, so let's use useState from React, and the initial state is 0. The state name is going to be counter and set counter. These methods right here can be constants, so I'm going to type const before the first one, and I'm going to paste to the other ones, and inside of them we can update the counter state with the set counter function. So instead of this .set state, let's call set counter, and inside of it we don't need the brackets, so let's make it just counter. Let's remove the this.state.counter, and we also need to remove the other brackets. So let's save the code now, and we expect the test to fail, right? Because it's not completely refactored yet. So the last thing we need to change right here is this render method. It's not necessary in function components, so I'm going to delete the first line of render and its bracket as well. I'll save the file, and we also need to remove these.state, so I'm going to delete it, and in the methods I can remove the this dot and save the file, and there it is. The test is passing, so our component is still working fine. Let's run the app again so we can see that in our browser. Okay, it's running, and as you can see, the component is still working properly because we didn't change its behavior. We just refactored the code to be a functional component now, and it still works the same. So as you can see, tests are very useful for helping us in refactoring old code, in testing the behavior of the components, so we can make sure the component is working correctly. So we have finished testing what we have planned for testing in this video, and now we can run all the tests of the application just for you to see. So here it is, all tests are passing, and we have tested the calculator class and the counter component, right? So in this video you have learned how to test a React component and a little bit of the flow for testing a React component. So we have tested the renderization of the component, the behavior of the component. So I hope you enjoyed the video. For the next video we're going to be testing this calculator component, which is a bit more complex than this counter component. It has 2 inputs, a select, and also a button that when you click it makes the operation that you selected here. So it is a bit more complex, so you're gonna learn how to interact with inputs, select inputs, and check conditional renderizations also. So it's gonna be pretty cool. And you also learn how to get the coverage report for your tests, so you'll be able to see how well your component is covered. So in this case our counter component is with 100% of code coverage. So in the next video you'll be able to learn how to get this coverage report from your project. So that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed and have learned something useful. If you liked the video, please consider pressing the like button in YouTube and sharing it with your friends that also want to learn how to test React applications. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching.